A warm welcome, Dr. Melissa Omino, to the Virgo Africa podcast. It's really a great pleasure to have you join us today. We have been really looking forward to this conversation, and so I'm really glad that it's finally happening. So, to start us off, I'd just like to allow you to introduce yourself. Um, Tell us about all the great work you're doing.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me onto the podcast, Moses. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name is Dr. Melissa Omino, and I'm the director at CIPIT, which is the Center for Intellectual Property and Information Technology Law at Strathmore University. And CIPIT is essentially a research center, and we focus on four thematic areas at the moment: intellectual property, AI, which is artificial intelligence law policy, data governance policy, and ICT policy. So you can tell that there's a word that keeps popping up, which is policy and law. And that's really our niche area of where we work at the center. So data governance is a really big thing for us. And I'm happy that our four niche areas speak to each other. There's no way you can talk about artificial intelligence without talking about data. And so you need to talk about data governance within the realm of artificial intelligence.
Mhm.
So that's what we do. And to break it down, maybe for people who are wondering, what does that mean? We just look at the laws and regulations, and specifically within Kenya and the wider African continent that affect data privacy, data protection, and we also look at laws and policies that would affect the growth of the artificial intelligence ecosystem. That's what we do at CIPIT. But for myself, my niche area is intellectual property. That's what I studied in school for my master's and my PhD. I studied intellectual property and trade law, and that's really what I love to do. And I'm fortunate enough that this also intersects with data governance and artificial intelligence.
Thank you very much. So, before we go into the proper technical details, I'd just like to find out, how did you end up in this space? And is this what you always wanted to do? So, if you could just speak a bit to your journey, what inspired you growing up? What are some of the choices that you made that led you here? Would really keen to just hear a bit of that.
Wow, that's a very interesting question. No, I did not think I'd end up here
Hmm.
when I was growing up. I actually wanted to be a journalist.
Ah,
When I was growing up, I really admired journalists. I'd watch CNN as a child, which was very weird, and always want to watch the news because I was so fascinated by the journalists who were reading the news. So I always wanted to be a journalist. But my father quickly dissuaded me from that by asking me just one question. He said, "Where will you work when you're 60 years old? Will you still be able to work as a journalist?" And that sort of set me on the path to become a lawyer. So I'm a lawyer by trade. I'm actually an advocate of the High Court, a commissioner of oaths, a notary public. Uh, those in the law field understand what that means. It just gives me the power to sign many documents for different people. And that's what I studied. So I studied law in South Africa. And while I was studying law in my undergrad, I came across intellectual property as one of the electives that I could study. And I was so fascinated when the professor came in with a bottle of Fanta and a bottle of Marmite. I don't know if people know what Marmite is, but it's a very unique jar. And that was the first lesson in intellectual property, and I was completely hooked. So then I decided to pursue a master's in intellectual property. And even then, I thought, okay, I'm going to do a master's and then I'll be a proper lawyer who specializes in intellectual property. So after bar school, I thought that I was going to practice law, which I did for 2 years. And I did not like going to court, even though I was good at it. I just didn't like it. And I had another conversation with my parents, and they really pushed me to pursue a PhD. And so I went and did a PhD also in intellectual property and trade law because of my supervisor. And I still didn't know what I was going to do with this PhD. I had no idea what I'd do with it. But in between this journey, I had started or co founded something called IP Check In with advocate Mwangi Manassas, which was a group of IP enthusiasts who would meet at the iHub or at a Java or at a Domans to talk about intellectual property news and occurrences. And one of the people who used to be a guest at IP Check-in was Professor Isaac Rutenberg. And Professor Isaac Rutenberg is the reason why I'm now a director of a research at Strathmore University. So that's my journey. It's like a series of fortunate accidents that led me here, but it wasn't really something that I had charted. But everything really revolves around intellectual property for me.
Very interesting, Dr. Melissa. Vulgro Africa's first office was located at the iLab, which is the innovation center at Strathmore University. And you could not miss Professor Rutenberg because
Yeah.
you don't see too many teaching staff members in Kenyan universities wearing ponytails. So, just to kind of um, update you, we have been having a conversation around AI in healthcare in this season of the podcast. And so far, we started off by discussing the AI for H program, which is one of the programs that led Vilgo Africa as a business incubator to start looking into AI, supporting AI startups. And then we have since spoken to two startup founders, just trying to get to understand how does it look like when you're building AI in Africa. So today, this conversation is a continuation of that discussion, looking onto the regulatory side. And one thing that's interesting is that the healthcare space industry is really the most regulated sector. And that's even before you add AI. So we're really keen to hear from you what your thoughts are. And I think maybe to start us off, you could just tell us what would you say is the current state of AI regulations in Africa?
I think that is a very timely question. AI regulation in Africa, what's the state of that? I think we are doing a great job in terms of the government looking at regulating AI. And when I say that, it's going to make innovators nervous because when innovators hear regulation, they think that innovation is being hindered. But no, I think Africa is going about it the right way. Why do I say that? Because there are a number of African countries who have set up AI national strategies as the first point in regulating artificial intelligence. And this means that they are not quick to enact laws or particular regulations that would stifle innovation, but are really looking towards setting up policies and sort of a roadmap that would help them understand the AI ecosystem and then see how they can regulate it. So, and some of these countries are Rwanda, Egypt, Senegal, and Mauritius. Is Mauritius part of Africa, Moses? But
Yes.
yes, those countries have national AI strategies. And this is also a wonderful time for Kenya because yesterday was the launch of the AI strategy development process by the government. And I was happy to be present there for that initial conversation. So the state is that no one has actually come up with a specific AI regulation, such as a law or an act, to put it in a different way, but there are strategies, meaning the governments are thinking around how to go about regulating that space, which I think is the best way to go about it. You have to understand the ecosystem before you actually throw laws or guardrails around it.
Yes.
It's also interesting to note what practitioners are doing. So there are practitioners who have come up with a practitioner's guide, for example, in Kenya. There's a guide that they came up with in terms of what they would like to see happening in that space and how they can ensure that they're doing it ethically and responsibly. And on the continental level, we also see that the AU has a continental strategy. So the regulatory space is sort of still nascent, meaning it's still at the beginning, but it is really starting to pick up if you're thinking about AI specific laws. But when you think about artificial intelligence, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. So we do have data protection laws, for example, and data governance work occurring on the continent. So that is already way, way, way ahead. There are acts, and from those acts, there are regulations, there are even regulatory bodies. So that's one of the areas that would affect artificial intelligence, and that's really a thriving area. There's also intellectual property, which has been there for time immemorial, which also exists. So it really depends on which lens you're looking at artificial intelligence. But for health specifically, I would say that it would really fall within data governance because of the sensitive data that is dealt with in health, and also the strategies that government use because health is really a government responsibility. Yeah.
Thank you. I really like your summary because um, I think one would imagine uh, that, as you said, innovators get really jittery when they hear regulation. And so, what you're saying is that governments are interested and they're going about it the right way. They're starting from the right place. They're not just coming into the space to kind of stifle. Now, I'm curious to find out from a regulator standpoint. If you were to sit in their shoes, what what are some of the challenges associated with AI in healthcare? What are some of the things that they need to think about?
Okay. So, being a regulator is a difficult job. And I'm always saying that the regulation of AI should not fall just with one regulator. I think there needs to
Mhm.
be a council of regulators or a consortium of regulators, right, that look at artificial intelligence. But that's still an idea that I'm sort of pushing for. On the ground, you'll find that the regulator most likely to deal with AI and health would be the Data Protection Commissioner, or whatever that person would be called in a different jurisdiction in Africa, right? So I'm really speaking from a Kenyan perspective. That's our Data Protection Commissioner who would do that, or the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner would be tasked with regulating artificial intelligence and health. Why? Because, as I said earlier, health really, or AI and health really involves a lot of data and a lot of what we call personal sensitive data. This is your age, your gender, your health status. Like you can imagine, for example, those who deal with HIV, their HIV status, those who have cancer diagnosis, for example. These are very sensitive. It's sensitive information, but we all know that artificial intelligence or algorithms only do well the more data that you feed them. So it's essential that a regulator would think about how much personal sensitive data is involved within a health ecosystem. That's one. Even innovators have to think about that. So the regulator would be regulating innovators. And this is usually such a complicated topic. I don't know why innovators do not think of themselves as data controllers or data processors, which are definitions that you'll find in either the regulations or the act. And it basically just means, are you holding personal sensitive data? Are you processing personal sensitive data? And all this occurs within an artificial intelligence app, for example. So it's sort of thinking about how do we allow people to handle sensitive personal data? That's one. Storage of this data, other than just handling it, where is it stored? In our Act, we have a very famous provision which talks about localization of data. That means certain data, including sensitive personal data, and that includes health data, should be held locally. That means we then need to think about the facilities that are available to actually hold that data locally. You have to think about the security of that data as well. So even if somebody is allowed to deal with personal sensitive data, what security measures are they using? So essentially, what I'm trying to describe is sort of like what is called a data protection impact assessment. Would be one of the things that the regulator would require people who are dealing or handling with health data to think about. And this includes government. It's not just about the private sector. Government as well would need to meet this threshold because the regulators do not only regulate the private sector, they also regulate government. And you'll find that there are so many interesting discussions about the independence of that office to do that. So that's one. But they also want to to ensure that there's innovation. So they need to do this in a way that includes capacity building or understanding with people who are dealing with that type of data, as well as listening to the feedback that they have as to how they can meet that threshold. And I'm being very general because if I get into it, I would then ask who exactly is dealing with health data. Are they local innovators or are they innovators from other spaces? And that's a whole other conversation.
Yes, that's a conversation that can become very controversial very fast, and it's one we can discuss on another day. Now, you did mention that you really don't understand why innovators get jittery when they hear regulation. So maybe, you know, because you sit at a very interesting place as a researcher, and I feel like that allows you to be an independent voice in a sense. So, what would you say to innovators? Um, how should they engage with this regulatory uh, processes?
Okay. I think this is the time for innovators to be involved in the process because, as I said, we are still, if I take the example of Kenya, we are at the moment where we are coming up with a national strategy for artificial intelligence. Innovators need to be in that room to talk about their the risks that they're facing, the challenges that they're facing. And when I say innovators, I mean local innovators, because I believe that what I would call big tech they already have avenues that their concerns may be heard. But I'm really concerned about
Yes,
local innovators as a researcher, because when I define an African AI, I define that as AI that's developed by African innovators to solve African problems. So that doesn't matter where they are based locally, but the focus must be to solve African problems. And of course, health is one of the issues that we have. It's one of the SDGs, right? That we need to goals that we need to meet. So I would say that they need to be in the room to sort of understand the the direction that the strategy is going towards. And I would say yesterday we did have a few innovators in the room, and I do think somebody from Bilgro was there. I think they were there.
yes.
So they
That's Dr. Dio. He's our head of AI.
yes, so they need to be in the room to first understand what this regulatory process is all about, because I think there's a lack of understanding between innovators and regulators and what they like to call lawyers. I say you lawyers are just giving us rules and things. But it's not just lawyers who are in that room. There are academics like myself. They are government officials. They are development partners. Because if we are very serious about looking at this space, the funding for AI in health comes from development partners, not really from government most of the time. So they also have a say in shaping that strategy. So I would tell them you need to be in the room. How can you be in the room? Even if you're not physically in the room, there are sort of pockets or associations that help carry a voice. There are communities of practice. You can, for example, there's Masahani, which I think is an African-wide community of practice for AI practitioners. There is the community of practice in AI in Kenya, just to name a few of places where innovators can go to put their voice down so that those people can then have the mandate or the duty to carry the voice of innovators forward, because there's that lack of understanding. So it starts with engagement and collaboration, right? So you have to have that collaborative spirit, that thirst to understand why regulation needs to be there. For Africa, it's especially important because of the inequalities that exist in our space, right? We do know there's a lot of historical background as to why Africa is where it is. And sometimes I find that innovators think that we are competing with Google, or you want to be the next Mark Zuckerberg, and you're not understanding the historical context that is existing that might hinder you from being that person, and how regulation can help you, right? Even accessibility to data, maybe local. local innovators should have more access to local data. Why? Because they understand local context and they might have less bias when they're dealing with that data. But in order for that to happen, we need to have innovators in the space to sort of say, hey, I am here. I exist as a local innovator who is working in health, who's looking for local solutions. Because if you rely on big tech, for example, to carry a voice, they don't. They have their own agenda. So that's one. So I've said many things. I've said one, you have to engage government. This is the right time on the continent to engage them because the strategies are being worked on now. Two, I've said there has to be collaboration amongst innovators themselves first, not even talking about innovators and government, done through communities of practice. This can be done both on a local level, local now, I mean nationally, but also on a continental level as well. There has to be a lot of effort put into understanding regulation and really shedding this lens that regulation is stifling because regulation can actually help local innovators.
Thank you for that. Now, still on the topic of innovators, um, is there really a real risk of um, losing IP? Because I know from our work with innovators, that's one of the concerns that they have when they hear regulation. It's a big, scary word. So maybe also just speaking to those fears, is there really real risk?
Okay. I'm taking a deep breath because I want to address this issue of intellectual property. I need to start with a story, right? The story I always start with is I ask people if you are a local innovator, a startup, you are a startup, how are you actually developing or writing code? Are you writing your own code? Are you starting from scratch when you're writing your own code? Or are you picking up code that has already existed somewhere and then you are developing it or adding onto it? That's one. And where are you getting the capital to invest in your startup? Have you crowdsourced or did you save? You have an MMF, that has millions of Kenya shillings or US dollars, and then that's what you're investing. Or is somebody giving you the funds to then create these algorithms that are solving the problems that you want with it as your startup? And somebody might wonder, why am I talking about these things? How do these things affect the question of intellectual property? They do because if you are receiving funding from somebody, especially if let's say it's a development partner, is giving you funding to come up with or to solve a particular problem using artificial intelligence, and let's say that's a health problem, then there are terms and conditions to the funding that you have received. And part of those terms and conditions, I can bet my life on it, are going to be on the intellectual property that attaches to whatever you create. So already you have agreed to a particular regime that is governing your, and I don't say ideas because intellectual property does not protect ideas, it protects the manifestation of an idea. So the material existence of your idea, right? So you have already agreed to how or what intellectual property applies to the work that you're doing once you accept those funds. Innovators don't know this. They don't think about this. So they need to read the grant agreements that they get because those grant agreements already apply a regime of intellectual property to any work that you will conduct or produce under that grant. And most of the time, that regime will be open source. They'll say that anything that is created here must be open source. So that's the data that you're collecting. If you modify the algorithms, the modification that you make, if you come up with new algorithms, those new algorithms all must be open source. And open source means that you bring it out to the world and anybody can utilize it. So that is not necessarily meaning that you can't make money off of the work. It just means it makes it a little bit harder to do that because other people now, you've sort of given your advantage to other people and said, here, this is how I did it. You shared how you did it. That's one. The second thing is usually when I talk to innovators, very few in Africa, very, very few of them are creating algorithms from scratch. Very few. One, I think it's because it's very
Hmm.
difficult to do. Two, I think it takes a lot of time and a lot of money to develop an algorithm from scratch. So people are utilizing these open source algorithms that are already out there. Now, if you utilize it, then there's usually a license that attaches to that work that you're using, and it will either tell you you must share it the same way that you obtained this one. So if it's open source, it must be open source, and there are different tiers or licenses. If it's for research, for example, you can do it this way. You can use it. They actually limit sometimes and say if you're going to use this for monetary gain, you cannot use this algorithm. Or if you do, then this is what you must do. Essentially, there are licenses that attach. And innovators don't normally think about these things. They just use them. They think because I found it online, it is free, I can use it the way I want to. No, it actually has a license attached to it. So the story is, as you're creating, or part of your startup needs to think about the intellectual property regime that will affect your startup and that will affect your operations. It will affect where you get your algorithms. It will affect who you accept funding from. It will affect the type of data that you're using and what happens to that data. So this, I don't know. I've even forgotten the question. I got so caught up in explaining that I forgot the question. But what I'm trying to say is these are the key things that innovators need to think about when they're talking about intellectual property. They jump to say, this person is copying me or this person is stealing my idea. Ideas are free, guys. Ideas cannot be protected. It
Hmm.
is the expression of your idea that is protected. And intellectual property has many facets. There are patents, for example, and depending on the jurisdiction that you're in, an algorithm can be patented or not. Mostly, it's under copyright. There are trademarks, that is the name of your startup, the name of your app. There's sui generis rights, like for example, to the data set. That data set can have its own form of intellectual property right attaching to it. So there's so many facets. They need to speak to an intellectual property professional to sort of help them. And I'm happy that there are many programs that exist where startup innovators are put into contact with intellectual property professionals to sort of figure out what's happening. So before they can say somebody is stealing their work, they really need to think about, have they infringed somebody's work already, number one, and what have they already agreed to in terms of how their work will be carried forward.
That's very insightful, Dr. Melissa. So, the bigger issue uh, as an innovator is really whether you have patentable AI to begin with. Um, are you relying on someone else's IP, or are you developing your own technology that you can then patent? So, back to the question of AI regulation in Africa, are there any specific regulatory frameworks or guidelines that we can learn from that could be particularly effective or innovative in addressing the challenges that come with the use of AI in healthcare?
The frameworks or guidelines that are particularly relevant for Africa in addressing AI in healthcare, like I said, we don't have much local African strategies or guidelines in place. We do have a few from a few countries I mentioned, like Rwanda, Egypt, Mauritius. I think that would be a great place to start to look at what our neighbors are doing and come up with sort of a continental strategy, which is essentially what the African Union is trying to do. The African Union has a continental strategy, which is very broad in terms of artificial intelligence, but because AI is a tool to be utilized in various aspects, health being one of them, then that continental strategy would be a great place to start in terms of looking at a framework or guideline relevant in addressing AI in healthcare. But looking further afield, which is not something that I usually like to do, but it's always great to also look at what is happening globally. We do have the OECD AI principles and the European Commission's AI regulations, which provide comprehensive guidelines emphasizing things like transparency, accountability, and they do have a human rights centric approach to the application of AI in different fields, including healthcare. So I would apply these, of course, with the caution that these have come from other jurisdictions and we can always localize them to fit the African context. So that is looking at the disparities that might exist in terms of access and availability, the digital gap or divide when we're trying to implement these frameworks or guidelines from other jurisdictions. But I would say we start with our neighbors and then we move forward.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. How do you see AI regulation evolving in healthcare in the coming years?
I think that this would require me to have a magic ball to sort of predict that. Why I say that is because 3 years ago, hardly anybody was talking about artificial intelligence on a wide scale other than development funders who were thinking about use cases of AI on the continent. At CIPIT, we were looking at what does the African AI ecosystem look like. So we really wanted to define African AI, as I did earlier, and we were also looking at who are the stakeholders. So we did a whole stakeholder mapping of primary and tertiary stakeholders involved in the AI ecosystem. And now I think everybody is marching towards thinking about how the use cases can be more ethical, can be more responsible, and more just for local African utilization. And this is not unique to Africa. Even globally, there's the tensions both in Europe and the US when you're talking about what is ethical AI, what is responsible AI. That is where regulation is moving towards. And to answer these questions, we have to define these terms of ethical and responsible. And of course, we have hints from the data governance regimes that I've said are already really well developed in Africa. We can think about how do we deal with personal sensitive data? How do we ensure that we are protecting the most vulnerable within our society? How are we ensuring that there's access to healthcare, for example, through the use of AI as a tool? And we need to be conscious of all the local context that exists in order for us to answer what is responsible and ethical artificial intelligence use or and responsible and ethical artificial intelligence product in healthcare. I'd like to emphasize that for healthcare, the threshold is higher than, for example, a chatbot that is dealing in the financial sector, because health is a sensitive topic. If you deny somebody the right to access healthcare, then you are actually violating somebody's human rights. Whereas somebody's financial outlook is also a right, it might not be at the same tier, depending on which lens you're using. But we all understand that healthcare is within the Bill of Rights. It is a very important top tier human right, because without health, then you cannot be functional and productive in society. So when dealing with access to health through artificial intelligence, that threshold is also high, and you have to be very aware about the context that we're using. So I think where we're heading to is we will have granular regulations, granular guidelines specific for the health sector, and people should expect that the threshold for that will be very high, just to ensure accountability for these apps, transparency of these apps, so no black box source coding. We would want to at least know what this algorithm is doing. We want to know what biases are in there so that we can ensure that we limit those biases, and also ensure that they are accessible to all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Melissa. This has been a very, very interesting and insightful conversation. I'm sure our listeners, particularly innovators, will have a lot to learn from your thoughts. And I'm really looking forward to where things go as far as regulating AI in general and AI, particularly in the healthcare sector, is concerned. And I'm very glad that we have people who are knowledgeable, such as yourself, as part of that process. And that means that we're going to be able to then put together regulation that speaks to the needs of our own innovators as Africans, especially in light of big tech, and then also that also speaks to ourselves as a continent and our needs in healthcare. So asante sana daktari. Um, we're really glad that you were able to join us for this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun. I had so much fun speaking with Moses, and I look forward to hearing more about your podcast and other episodes.